The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of scorn. It coated Elara's tongue, settled in the folds of her threadbare gray dress, and mingled with the sweat of fear on her skin. She stood on a makeshift auction block, 3 rough-hewn planks laid across a pair of barrels. Outside the saloon, the afternoon sun a merciless hammer against her head. Below her, a crowd of men festered, their faces a gallery of leering curiosity and pious judgment. And now, for the final lot of the Miller estate, bellowed a man with a waistcoat straining against his belly and a voice like gravel in a tin bucket. This was Mr. Cobb, the town's self-appointed arbiter of assets and souls. A most unique piece of property. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. They knew who she was. Every man, woman, and child in the territory had heard the whispers that followed her like a death shroud. The Black Widow of Whisper Creek. 26 years of age, sound a tooth, and previously married, Cobb announced, his lip curling with distaste on the last 2 words. Her late husbands, both good men of this county, met with unfortunate ends. As she is without prospects and a ward of the town, she is being sold as an indentured housekeeper. The term is for 5 years. 5 years of service for a home and keep. He didn't need to say more. The implication hung heavy and foul in the air. 2 husbands in the ground before she was 30. One in a mine collapse, the other from a fever that came on and took him in less than a day. It was God's judgment, they said. She was cursed, they whispered, a harbinger of doom. "What's the starting bid for the curse?" a grimy miner shouted, drawing a round of cruel laughter. Cobb ignored him, though a flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Do I hear $50? A strong back for the fields, a woman to warm the hearth. $50? Silence. The men shuffled their feet. They looked at her, at her tangled raven-black hair, at the defiant set of her jaw, at the deep haunted green of her eyes. They saw not a woman in need, but a walking tombstone. The price of a warm bed wasn't worth a cold grave. "Come now, gentlemen, this is a bargain," Cobb urged, his frustration growing. $40. Give me 40. Still nothing. The sun beat down. Elara could feel a single bead of sweat trace a path from her temple down her cheek, like a tear she refused to shed. She locked her gaze on the hazy horizon, on the distant jagged peaks that promised an escape she could never reach. She would not give these men the satisfaction of her despair. 30, Cobb's voice was getting desperate. 20, for God's sake, someone give me $20 for her. The silence stretched, becoming its own form of mockery. Elara's resolve began to crack. Humiliation was a physical thing, a hot poker pressing against her spine. To be unwanted so publicly, so completely, it was a pain sharper than any stone they could have thrown. $10, Cobb pleaded. She can cook, she can clean, $10. From the back of the crowd, a voice, low and rough as unpolished granite, cut through the stifling quiet. $5. Every head turned. The voice had come from the shadows of the livery stable, from a man who had stood so still he had been all but invisible. He stepped forward now, and the crowd parted for him as if he carried a contagion of his own. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sun-weathered skin that spoke of a life lived under an open sky. A dark, sweat-stained hat was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the harsh lines of his face or the silver that threaded the dark hair at his temples. His clothes were worn but clean, a simple canvas coat, denim trousers, and scuffed boots. But it was his eyes that held the town captive. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they carried a weariness so profound it seemed to age him beyond his years. This was Silas Blackwood, a man who kept to himself on a failing ranch at the edge of the territory, a man who hadn't been seen in town for the better part of a year. Cobb blinked, momentarily speechless. $5? Mr. Blackwood, surely you jest. I don't jest, Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He walked slowly toward the block, his gaze fixed not on Cobb but on Elara. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fierce pride in her posture that was at war with the terror in her eyes. He saw a kindred brokenness. $5 is the bid, Silas repeated, his voice carrying an unnerving finality. A nervous energy shot through the crowd. Silas Blackwood buying the Black Widow. It was a folktale in the making. The town pariah buying the town curse. Going once, Cobb said, looking around, hoping for another offer, any offer. No one spoke. They were too stunned, too captivated by the grim theater unfolding before them. Going twice. Silas's gaze never left Elara's. In that moment, she felt something shift. It wasn't kindness she saw in his eyes, not pity. It was recognition. He was not looking at a curse. He was looking at a person. Sold. Cobb banged a small wooden gavel against the barrel. To Mr. Silas Blackwood for $5. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He carefully counted out $5 silver, their gleam looking obscene in the dusty light. He placed them in Cobb's outstretched hand. "The papers," Silas said, his voice a low command. Cobb hastily signed the indenture contract and handed it to him. Silas didn't even glance at it. He folded it and tucked it into his coat pocket. He then turned and walked to the auction block, extending a callous, steady hand to Elara. She stared at it, at the scarred knuckles and the dirt beneath the nails. It was the hand of a man who worked, who struggled. It was the first hand offered to her in help, not in accusation, in years. After a long, suspended moment, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. His grip was firm, solid. He helped her down from the block, his touch lingering no longer than necessary. Without a word, he turned and began to walk toward the livery stable where a lone, tired-looking horse was tied to a wagon. The crowd parted for them again, their whispers now a venomous hiss. "He's bought his own death warrant. The devil takes his own. Poor fool. His ranch is already cursed. What's one more?" Elara walked beside Silas, her head held high, her eyes fixed forward. She did not know if she had been rescued or merely sold to a different kind of hell. But as they left the jeering crowd behind, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots in the dust, a strange, fragile seed of something she hadn't felt in years began to stir in her chest. It was a ghost of a feeling, a memory of what it felt like to not be utterly and completely alone. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a silent one. Silas handled the reins of the tired horse, his shoulders set in a line of grim resolve. Elara sat beside him on the wagon bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the indenture papers a burning weight in his pocket and a cold dread in her heart. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The landscape grew harsher, the fertile valley giving way to arid scrubland and weathered rock formations that looked like the bones of long-dead giants. This was the edge of the world, a place where things came to die. It suited him, she thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled the wagon to a halt. "We're here." Elara looked. Before them, nestled in a shallow, rocky basin, was what could generously be called a ranch. The house was a small, unpainted, clapboard structure, its wood weathered to a silver gray. The roof sagged in the middle and a few of the windows were boarded up. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, as if a strong wind might finally give it the excuse it needed to collapse. "Aye," Quonsat said. The fences were in disrepair, and the land itself looked parched and exhausted. A lone windmill turned with a mournful, rhythmic squeal. This wasn't a failing ranch. It was a dying one. It was the physical embodiment of the emptiness in the man who sat beside her. Silas climbed down from the wagon without a word and began to unhitch the horse. His movements were economical, practiced. He didn't look at her, didn't offer any instruction. It was as if he'd already forgotten she was there. Elara hesitated for a moment, then slid carefully from the wagon seat. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the tension of the day. She stood there, a solitary figure in the vast, indifferent landscape, and watched him lead the horse toward the leaning barn. The place was steeped in a silence so profound it felt louder than the whispers of the town. When he emerged from the barn, he finally looked at her, his stormy eyes assessing her from across the dusty yard. "The house has 2 rooms, he said, his voice as dry as the dirt beneath their feet. "The main room and a bedroom. You'll take the main room. There's a cot in the corner." He started toward the house, and she followed a few paces behind, her worn shoes scuffing in the dust. The front door groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The inside was as bleak as the outside. It was starkly clean, but threadbare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a simple table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a small cot with a thin blanket was pushed into the far corner. A door on the opposite wall presumably led to his bedroom. The air was stale, smelling of wood smoke and solitude. "There's a well out back, a pump in the kitchen," he stated, pointing to a small hand pump and basin. "The pantry is there. It's not much, but it's what there is." He gestured to a small cupboard. Your duties are outlined in the contract: cooking, cleaning, mending. You start tomorrow." He spoke to her as if she were a piece of equipment he'd acquired, a tool to be put to use. There was no welcome, no curiosity, just a flat statement of facts. It was a coldness that was somehow less cruel than the town's hot-blooded hate. It was simply empty. Elara found her voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Why?" Silas, who had turned to stir the ashes in the cold fireplace, stilled. He slowly straightened, turning to face her. The fading light from the open door cast his face in shadow, making his features seem carved from stone. "Why what? Why did you buy me?" The words felt shameful on her tongue. "You heard them. You know what they call me." He held her gaze for a long moment, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something behind the weariness. It was a raw, deep-seated pain. "I know what it's like to be haunted," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "And I needed a housekeeper. The price was right." The explanation was both simple and deeply complex. He hadn't bought her in spite of the rumors, but perhaps because of them. He saw a fellow outcast, another soul marked by death. But his final words brought her back to the cold reality of her situation. She wasn't a kindred spirit. She was a $5 transaction. She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the dusty floorboards. "I understand." "Good." The single word was clipped, closing the conversation. He moved to the pantry, taking out a small sack of flour and a tin of beans. He placed them on the table. "I'll be in the barn. Tend to the horse. See to your own supper." With that he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet, desolate house. The silence pressed in on her. She looked at the meager provisions on the table, then at the cot that was to be her bed. 5 years. 5 years in this tomb of a house with this ghost of a man. A wave of despair so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She stumbled to the table and gripped its edge, her knuckles turning white. What had she done? Fleeing one prison only to be sold into another. But then Silas's words echoed in her mind. "I know what it's like to be haunted." He hadn't looked at her with fear or revulsion. He had looked at her with a stark, unsettling understanding. He was not a cruel man, she sensed. He was a broken one. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Elara pushed herself upright. She would not crumble. She had survived whispers and accusations, loneliness and grief. She would survive this. She was the Black Widow of Whisper Creek. She was a survivor. She walked to the kitchen pump and began to work the handle. The rhythmic squeak and gurgle was the first sound of life in the silent house. She would not just survive here, she would find a way to live. The first week was a silent ballet of chores and avoidance. Elara rose before dawn, the chill of the house seeping into her bones. She would start the fire, put coffee on to boil, and make a simple breakfast of biscuits or oatmeal. Silas would emerge from his room, already dressed, take his plate and eat at the table without a word. His eyes would be distant, fixed on some point beyond the grimy window pane. When he was done, he would place the plate in the wash basin and leave for the day, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of his ranch. Elara would then begin the relentless work of her indenture. He scrubbed the floors until the wood began to show its true, lighter grain. She washed the windows, letting precious sunlight spill into the gloomy main room for the first time in what seemed like years. She mended Silas's work clothes, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She explored the pantry and found it pitifully stocked, but she was resourceful. She made soups from dried beans and the few withered vegetables she found in a neglected garden patch behind the house. She learned the geography of Silas's grief through the objects he left untouched. In a small, dust-covered box on the mantelpiece, she found a tiny pair of baby's shoes and a woman's silver locket. She closed the box gently, a profound ache in her own chest. This was not just a house of solitude. It was a house of mourning. One afternoon, while searching the barn for old rags, she heard a faint, distressed bleating. Tucked away in a dark, forgotten stall, she found a newborn calf, shivering and weak, abandoned by its mother. Its ribs were starkly visible, and its breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Something protective and fierce rose in Elara. She saw in this small, struggling creature a reflection of her own fight. She half-dragged, half-carried the calf back toward the house, her muscles straining. Silas was returning from the far pastures as she emerged from the barn, the calf cradled in her arms. He stopped dead, his face a thunderous mask. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "It's starving," Elara said, her own voice firm, refusing to be intimidated. "The mother abandoned it. It will die if we leave it." "It's already dying," Silas said flatly, his eyes hard. "That's the way of things. Leave it." "No?" The word hung in the air between them, a small, defiant spark. It was the first time she had directly contradicted him. He stared at her, his jaw tight. He saw the stubborn set of her chin, the fire in her eyes, and the gentle way she held the dying animal. "It's a waste of time and resources we don't have," he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Life is never a waste of time," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "Let me try. I won't use any of your provisions. I'll find a way." He watched her for a long, tense moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the dusty yard. He saw her defiance, but he also saw a desperate need to nurture, to save something. It was a need he had buried in himself long ago. With a short, frustrated sigh, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, but it dies in the barn, not in the house." He turned and strode away, leaving her with her small, shivering burden. It was a victory, however small. She carried the calf to a sheltered corner of the barn, made a bed of clean straw for it, and then set to work. She remembered her grandmother, an old woman wise in the ways of the earth, using a concoction of warm water, molasses, and a bit of precious canned milk to save a weak lamb once. She used the last of the molasses from the pantry and a spoonful of the condensed milk she'd been saving. She coaxed the weak calf to drink from a rag soaked in the warm, sweet liquid. For hours she stayed with it, whispering soft words, willing it to live. For 3 days the calf's life hung by a thread. Elara tended to it relentlessly, her own meals forgotten. Silas watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but he started leaving a small pail of fresh goat's milk by the barn door every morning. He never acknowledged it, and she never thanked him. It was a silent, unspoken pact. On the 4th morning, Elara entered the barn to find the calf standing on its own wobbly legs, bleeding with a newfound strength. It nudged her hand, seeking more milk. A smile, the first genuine smile to touch her lips in years, spread across her face. Later that day, as she was hoeing the hardened soil of the vegetable patch, determined to bring it back to life, Silas approached. He stopped a few feet away, holding a rusty but serviceable spade. "This'll work better," he said, holding it out to her. She looked from the spade to his face. His eyes were on the small patch of green shoots she had managed to coax from the dead earth. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the tool. "The calf," he said, his voice low. "It looks stronger." "He is," she replied. "I named him Moses." A flicker of something, amusement, surprise, crossed Silas's face. "Moses? Because I pulled him from the brink," she said simply. Silas looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time since the auction. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the earnest light in her green eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her. She wasn't a curse. She was tending his garden, saving his livestock, and bringing a quiet, steady life back into the dead spaces of his home. She was pulling everything from the brink. He gave a slow nod. "It's a good name." He turned and walked away. But something had shifted between them. The silence was no longer a wall, but a space that held the possibility of understanding. In the dying light of that evening, as Elara watched him mend a section of broken fence, she realized she wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was becoming a part of this broken place, and in some small, inexplicable way, she was beginning to heal it. The miracle of the calf was a quiet turning point. The rhythm of the ranch began to change, subtly at first, then with a gathering momentum. Elara, armed with the spade Silas had given her, attacked the neglected garden with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She found a small stash of old seeds in a tin box, squash, beans, corn, and prayed they were still viable. She hauled water bucket by bucket from the well, her hands becoming calloused, her back strong. Silas watched her toil from a distance. He saw the small patch of brown earth slowly transform under her care, turning a hopeful shade of green. He had long since given up on that garden, just as he had given up on most things. Seeing it come to life stirred something dormant within him. One evening he came to the table not with his usual silence, but with a question. "Where did you learn to work the land like that?" Elara, dishing out a stew made from dried beans and the first tender squash blossoms from her garden, was taken aback by the directness of the question. "My father was a farmer," she said quietly, before he passed. "He taught me that the earth gives back what you give it." Silas absorbed this. his gaze drifting to the window, to the land that had taken so much from him. His wife, Martha, and their infant son, Daniel, had been taken by a fever that swept through the territory 2 winters ago. After that, the land had seemed to mock him, the soil turning to dust in his hands, the sky refusing rain. He had seen it as a punishment, a reflection of the barrenness in his own soul. "This land doesn't give back much," he said, his voice laced with old bitterness. "Perhaps no one has given it anything to work with for a long time," Elara countered gently. His head napped back to her, a spark of anger in his eyes, but as he looked at her earnest, unapologetic face, the anger died, replaced by a weary resignation. She was right. He hadn't given it anything but his grief. The next day, he spent the entire morning clearing rocks from a larger patch of land adjacent to her small garden. He didn't say a word about it, but the action spoke volumes. It was an admission, a concession, an act of hope. Their silent partnership extended beyond the garden. Elara discovered Silas was a skilled carpenter, though his tools were rusted and neglected. She spent an afternoon painstakingly cleaning and oiling them. The following day, she found the sagging porch step had been replaced, the new wood a stark contrast to the old. One sweltering afternoon, while mending a fence on the far side of the property, Elara stumbled upon it. Tucked away in a small, hidden canyon choked with overgrown weeds and brush was a spring. A steady trickle of clear, cool water seeped from a rock face, pooling in a small basin before disappearing into the thirsty ground. She ran back to the house, her heart pounding with excitement, heedless of the thorny branches that snagged at her dress. She found Silas in the barn, reinforcing the leaning wall. "Silas," she cried, breathless. "I found it. I found water." He straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. "The well gives water." "No, not the well, a spring. In the West Canyon, a real running spring." He stared at her, disbelief warring with a dawning curiosity. "The West Canyon is dry, always has been." "It's not. It's overgrown, but the water is there. If we could dig a channel, it could irrigate the fields by the house, the ones you cleared." For the first time since she had arrived, she saw a genuine spark of life in his eyes, a flicker of the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out. He dropped his hammer and followed her, his long strides easily keeping pace with her excited half-running. When he saw the spring, he fell to his knees, scooping the cool water into his hands. He let it run over his face, through his fingers. It was real, a steady, reliable source of water on a ranch that had been dying of thirst. It was a lifeline. He looked up at Elara, who stood watching him, her face flushed with triumph. The sun, filtering through the sparse leaves of a cottonwood, caught the green of her eyes. In that moment, she looked less like a widow haunted by death, and more like a prophetess who had divined life from the barren rock. "How?" he breathed, the word full of awe. "I just looked," she said with a small shrug. "You get used to looking for signs of life in dead places." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was the dead place. She was the one looking for signs of life. That evening, a visitor arrived. A horse and buggy crested the rise, kicking up a plume of dust. As it drew closer, Elara felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The man holding the reins was Marcus Thorne, her second husband's brother. He was a portly man with a self-satisfied smirk and small, greedy eyes that always seemed to be calculating worth. He pulled his buggy to a stop and climbed down, dusting off his fine town coat. "Blackwood," he said, his voice overly friendly as he nodded at Silas. He then turned his gaze on Elara, and his smirk widened. "Elara, I see you've found rustic accommodations. What do you want, Horn?" Silas asked, his voice low and cold. He moved to stand slightly in front of Elara, a subtle protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by either of them. "I've come out of concern," Thorne said, his expression a mockery of sympathy. "The whole town is worried. This man, a recluse, buying you for a pittance. It's not right. I've come to make a better offer. I'll take her off your hands, Blackwood. Double what you paid, $10. I'll see she's properly cared for." The offer was an insult wrapped in false charity. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to possess her, to control the woman who, by rights of his brother's death, he felt he should have inherited along with the general store. "She's not for sale," Silas said, his voice flat and dangerous. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "She's indentured property. The contract is transferable. It's business." "This is my property," Silas said. his hand gesturing vaguely to the ranch around them. "And you're trespassing. I suggest you get back in your buggy and leave." "You're making a mistake, Blackwood," Thorne sneered. "You don't know what you've brought into your home. She's a plague. Everything she touches withers and dies." Before he could stop himself, Silas glanced at the thriving garden, thought of the newborn calf in the barn, of the spring in the canyon. He looked at Elara, who stood tall and defiant, no longer the terrified woman on the auction block. A slow, humorless smile touched Silas's lips. "Seems her luck is changing." The words, so simple, were a declaration, a statement of alliance. He was no longer just her keeper, he was her defender. Thorne, seeing the granite resolve in Silas's face, sputtered for a moment, then climbed back into his buggy, his face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, Blackwood, both of you," he shouted, whipping his horse into a gallop and disappearing in a cloud of vengeful dust. Silas and Elara stood in silence, watching him go. The threat lingered in the air, but it felt distant. Something more important had just happened. Silas had defended her. He had chosen her. He turned to her, his stormy eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Thank you." He simply nodded, but the space between them was charged with a new, unspoken current. He had paid $5 for a housekeeper. He was beginning to realize he had gotten something infinitely more valuable. The promise Silas made was not one of words, but of action. The day after Thorne's visit, he began to work with a relentless, focused energy Elara had not yet seen. The man who had been moving through his days like a sleepwalker was suddenly wide awake. Together they drew plans in the dirt with a stick, mapping out a path for the water. The next morning they began the back-making work of digging the irrigation ditch from the spring in the West Canyon to the fields by the house. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. Silas, with his raw strength, broke the hard, rocky ground with a pickaxe. Elara, with her steady endurance, followed with a shovel, clearing the channel. The sun was a brutal master, but they did not stop. Sweat stung their eyes and caked the dust to their skin. Their muscles screamed in protest, but in the shared hardship a new kind of intimacy was forged. They learned the rhythm of each other's labor, the cadence of their re-breathing. He would stop and pass her the canteen without being asked. She would have a piece of bread ready for him when he paused to wipe his brow. In the evenings they would collapse at the table, too exhausted to speak much, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the deep satisfaction of shared purpose. The house, once a tomb, was now a refuge from the day's labor, a place to tend to their sore muscles and quiet their minds. One evening, as she was salving her blistered hands with a homemade comfrey poultice, Silas spoke from across the table. "My wife, Martha," he began, his voice rough. He stared into the flame of the lantern, not at her. "She loved this land. She saw things in it I couldn't. She believed it could be a paradise." He fell silent for a long moment. "When she and the boy, when they died, the paradise died with them. I think I hated the land for it, for living when they didn't." Elara listened, her heart aching for him. She didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She simply sat with him in his confession, her quiet presence a testament that he was no longer alone in his grief. "My first husband, Thomas," she found herself saying, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man, a kind man. He used to sing while he worked in the mines. He said it kept the darkness at bay. When the tunnel collapsed, the silence was the worst part." She paused, the memory a sharp pain. "My second husband, Samuel, he was older, a widower. He offered me safety when no one else would. He was sick, much sicker than he let on. The town doctor said his heart just gave out. But Marcus, his brother, said I'd exhausted him, drained the life from him." The whispers started then. They sat in the flickering lantern light, two souls laid bare, their tragedies shared in the quiet intimacy of the small kitchen. He had not bought a curse. He had bought a woman who understood loss as deeply as he did. A week later, the ditch was finished. It was a crude thing, a scar carved into the earth, but it was beautiful. Silas opened the small dam they had built at the spring, and with a gurgle and a sigh, the water began its slow, steady journey. It trickled down the channel, dark and rich, soaking into the thirsty soil. When it reached the cleared fields by the house, it spread out, a shimmering, life-giving blanket. They stood together, watching the water work its magic, the setting sun casting their long shadows across the newly damp earth. "You did it," Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He looked at her, at the dirt on her face and the weariness in her posture, and he saw the most resilient, beautiful thing he had ever known. "We did it," she corrected softly. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a real smile this time, one that reached his stormy eyes and transformed his harsh features into something gentle and handsome. The sight of it made Elara's breath catch in her throat. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." That night, the air felt different. The mournful squeal of the windmill was now joined by the soft, constant whisper of running water. It was the sound of life, the sound of hope. Their trust, nurtured by shared labor and whispered confessions, began to blossom. He started calling her Elara, not woman or you. She found herself watching for him to return from the far pastures in the evenings, a knot of anticipation in her stomach. But the shadow of Marcus Thorne and the town's judgment still loomed. They were an island of fledgling hope in a sea of suspicion. Next afternoon, the circuit preacher, Reverend Gideon, a man with eyes as cold and hard as river stones, rode out to the ranch. He claimed it was a pastoral visit, but his gaze was full of accusation. "Brother Blackwood," he said, his voice oozing false piety, "the townsfolk are concerned. It is an unseemly arrangement, you living out here alone with this woman." "She is my housekeeper," Silas said, his voice level, betraying no emotion. "A housekeeper with a reputation that precedes her," the Reverend pressed. "2 husbands in the grave. It is a sign of God's displeasure. You are courting disaster, son. You are inviting darkness into your home." Elara, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped out into the sunlight, her hands on her hips. "The only darkness I see here, Reverend, is the one you bring with you. You speak of God's displeasure, but I have seen more of God's grace in the water of that spring and the heart of this man than I ever saw in your church." The Reverend was taken aback by her audacity. His face purpled with indignation. "You are a blasphemous, wicked woman, and you are a fearful, small-minded man," Silas said, stepping to Elara's side. His presence was a solid wall of support. "My home and who I share it with is my business, not yours and not the town's. You are not welcome here." Reverend Gideon, sputtering in righteous fury, mounted his horse and rode off, promising fire and brimstone. Silas and Elara watched him go, then looked at each other. They were allies, they were partners. And in that moment, standing together against the world, they both knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that they were becoming something more. With the water came life, and with life came the slow, steady healing of the ranch. Silas and Elara planted the fields they had cleared. Corn, beans, and squash, the A3 sisters as Elara's father had called them. The seeds, nourished by the spring water and the relentless sun, sprouted with an almost defiant vigor. The ranch, which had been a monument to decay, began to breathe again. Silas, his purpose renewed, repaired the barn until it stood straight and true. He mended every last foot of fence, his hammer blows ringing out in the morning air like a proclamation. Elara's garden overflowed with vegetables. She started a small flock of chickens, their cheerful clucking replacing the mournful squeal of the windmill as the ranch's primary soundtrack. Moses, the calf she had saved, was now a sturdy, rambunctious yearling who followed her everywhere. The house, too, was transformed. Elara filled the windowsills with pots of wild herbs she'd found growing in the canyon. Thyme, rosemary, and mint. Their fragrance chased the last of the stale, sorrowful air from the corners of the rooms. The food on their table was no longer a grim necessity, but a celebration of their labor. But the most profound transformation was in Silas. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a clear, steady light. The harsh lines of his face softened. He began to speak more, sharing stories of his childhood, of his dreams for the ranch before Martha's death. He even laughed, a low, rusty sound at first, but one that grew more frequent and natural as the days passed. He found himself watching Elara constantly. He watched the way the sun caught the raven sheen of her hair when she bent over the garden. He watched the efficient grace of her hands as she kneaded dough. He watched the quiet strength in her face as she looked out over the land they were rebuilding together. He had bought her for $5 to be his housekeeper, but she had become the architect of his resurrection. One evening, after a long day of harvesting their first crop of corn, they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. A comfortable silence settled between them. The kind that exists only between two people who no longer need words to understand one another. I haven't seen the stars look this bright in a long time, Silas said quietly, his voice full of a strange wonder. Maybe you just weren't looking up, Elara replied, a soft smile in her voice. He turned to her. In the pale moonlight, her face was serene, beautiful. The brand of Black Widow seemed like a cruel, impossible lie. This woman was not a harbinger of death. She was the embodiment of life. Elara, he said, his voice suddenly thick. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused and strong, yet they felt small and delicate in his. What you've done here, what you've done for me, thank you, isn't a big enough word. Her heart fluttered at his touch. You did it too, Silas. I just reminded you how. You did more than that, he insisted, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. You brought me back from the dead. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air crackled with a sudden, intense energy. This was the moment she had been both dreading and longing for. This was the moment where everything would change. She could see the question in his eyes, the deep, yearning hope. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His kiss was gentle at first, hesitant, as if he were touching something sacred and fragile. It was a kiss of gratitude, of reverence. But as she responded, her lips parting softly beneath his, the kiss deepened, becoming something more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness, of a profound hunger for connection. It was the kiss of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. Elara, he whispered, his voice a prayer. She was no longer his housekeeper. He was no longer her master. They were two halves of a whole, fused together by hardship and hope, but their fragile paradise was not to last. A few days later, the sheriff from Redemption Gulch rode out to the ranch, his face grim. He was a decent man, but weak-willed, easily swayed by public opinion. Silas, he said, dismounting. He avoided looking at Elara. There's been a development regarding the death of Samuel Miller. A cold dread washed over Elara. What kind of development? The sheriff shifted his weight uncomfortably. Marcus Thorne came to me. He's petitioning the circuit judge. He claims he has new evidence that his brother's death was not from natural causes. He's accusing you, ma'am, of murder. The sheriff's words fell like stones into the quiet peace of the ranch. Murder. The word was a serpent, coiling in the sunlit air, its venom potent enough to poison everything they had built. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She had thought the whispers were the worst it could get, but this was a formal accusation, a legal proceeding. This was a threat that couldn't be ignored or outrun. Silas stepped forward, his body rigid with fury. Evidence? What evidence could that snake possibly have after all this time? The sheriff, a man named Tate, had the decency to look ashamed. He claims he found a vial, hidden in a lockbox of Miller's. Says it contains wolfsbane. He's saying she poisoned him slow-like to make it look like a sickness. That's a lie. Elara's voice was sharp, cutting through her shock. Marcus was the one who cleaned out Samuel's things. If there was a vial, he's the one who put it there. I'll believe you, ma'am, Sheriff Tate said, his gaze finally meeting hers, full of a weary pity. But Thorne has the preacher and half the town council backing him. They're saying you fooled Blackwood here, that you're just biding your time. The judge, he's a hard man. He listens to men like Thorne and Reverend Gideon. He's issued a warrant for your arrest. Silas moved to stand directly in front of Elara, a human shield. You're not taking her. Silas, don't make this difficult, the sheriff pleaded. It's my job. If you resist, he'll have you arrested for obstruction. Then who will be here to help her? They'll bring her to the jail in Redemption Gulch to await the judge's arrival next week. You can hire a lawyer. You can fight this the right way. Silas's jaw was a knot of granite. The thought of Elara in a cell at the mercy of the town that despised her was unbearable. He looked at her, at the fear warring with defiance in her eyes. He saw the trap closing around them. Thorne didn't just want Elara punished. He wanted to destroy Silas's newfound happiness, to ruin the man who had stood up to him. He's right, Silas, Elara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She placed a hand on his arm. If I run, they'll say it's an admission of guilt. We have to face this. Her courage was a physical blow to him. She, who had every reason to crumble, was the one thinking clearly. He looked from her determined face to the sheriff's apologetic one. He was trapped. "I'll ride with you," Silas said to Tate, his voice a low growl. "I'm not leaving her side." The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a grim parody of their first journey. This time, Silas drove the wagon with a seething, controlled rage, while Elara sat beside him, her head held high, a queen being led to her execution. Sheriff Tate rode alongside, a reluctant warden. When they reached the town, it was as if a festival of cruelty had been declared. People emerged from the general store, the saloon, the church, their faces alight with a grim, righteous excitement. They pointed and whispered, their voices louder and bolder now that Elara was officially a prisoner. "See? Told you she was a killer. The devil gets his due. Poor Silas Blackwood. He'll be next if he's not careful." Silas's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles white. He wanted to lash out, to scream at him, to make them see the goodness and light in the woman beside him, but he knew it would be useless. Their minds were closed, sealed tight by fear and prejudice. The town jail was a squat, miserable brick building next to the sheriff's office. It consisted of 2 small barred cells. Tate unlocked one, the sound of the metal bolt sliding back echoing the finality of their situation. The cell was dark and smelled of damp stone and despair. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Tate mumbled as Elara stepped inside. She didn't look at him. She looked at Silas, her green eyes conveying a world of fear, trust, and a plea to be strong. "I will get you out of here," Silas vowed, his voice low and fierce for her ears only. "I swear it." The heavy door clanged shut, and the bolt slid home. The sound shattered something inside Silas. He had rescued her from the auction block only to lead her to a cage. He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the cold bars, before turning to face the sheriff. "I need a lawyer, the best one in this territory," Tate sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "The best one is in Prescott. Cost you a fortune, Silas, a fortune I don't think you have." "I'll sell the ranch if I have to," Silas said without a moment's hesitation. The land, the crops, the water, it was all meaningless without her. The ranch wasn't the miracle. She was. "What's his name?" "Elias Thorne," the sheriff said. Silas froze. "Thorne? Any relation to Marcus?" "His cousin," Tate confirmed grimly. "They don't get on, haven't spoken in years, but blood is blood." The trap was more insidious than he'd imagined. The only man who could save her was related to the man who wanted to condemn her. Silas felt a surge of cold, hard resolve. If the system was rigged, he would have to find a way to break it. He would not let them take her from him. He had found his miracle, and he would tear down heaven and earth to keep her. Silas spent the next 2 days in a fever of desperate activity. He rode his horse half to death, getting to the neighboring town of Dusty Flats, where he sold the 2 best heifers from his small herd. It wasn't much, but combined with the money he'd saved from the first corn harvest, it was enough for a down payment on a lawyer. The irony was bitter. He was selling off the fruits of their shared labor to save the woman who had made it all possible. He returned to Redemption Gulch and wired the money to Elias Thorne in Prescott, along with a telegram pleading the urgency of the case. He received a curt reply, "Will arrive day before the hearing. Send details." With the lawyer secured for now, Silas turned his attention to the town itself. He walked the dusty streets, his face a grim mask, trying to find a crack in the wall of certainty that surrounded Elara's guilt. He spoke to the doctor, an old weary man who reeked of whiskey. "Samuel Miller's heart was weak, son," the doctor slurred, not meeting Silas's eye. "Could it have been poison? Anything's possible. Could it have been his time? That's possible too. Marcus Thorne pays his bills on time, that's all I know for sure." It was the same everywhere he went. The blacksmith, the general store owner, the stable master. They all mumbled vague platitudes, their eyes shifting away, unwilling to cross Marcus Thorne and the powerful current of public opinion. They were cowards, content to see an innocent woman hang rather than risk their own comfort. His only moments of solace were the 2 times a day Sheriff Tate allowed him to visit Elara. He would bring her food from the hotel, better than the slop the jail provided, and they would speak in low voices through the bars. She was pale and tired, but her spirit was not broken. "You need to find out why, Silas," she said during one visit, her voice a fierce whisper. Well, is Marcus doing this now? He could have done this months ago. Why wait? Her question ignited a spark in his mind. She was right. Thorne's timing was strange. He had let her go to the auction, let her live on Silas's ranch for months. The accusation had only come after the ranch had started to thrive, after Thorne had seen for himself that Elara was not a curse, but a blessing. He wanted your husband's store, Silas reasoned, thinking aloud. But he got it. What else could there be? Samuel didn't trust him, Elara said, her brow furrowed in concentration. He told me once that Marcus had a gambler's heart and a thief's hands. He changed his will just before he died. He was going to leave the store to a distant nephew, not to Marcus. But after he died, the old will was the only one that could be found. Marcus inherited everything. Elsie. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. So he had a motive to want Samuel dead. Everyone assumed he would inherit. No one knew about the new will except me, Samuel, and the lawyer who drew it up, Mr. Abernathy, Elara explained. Mr. Abernathy moved away right after the funeral. He said the mountain air didn't agree with his constitution. Another piece. A lawyer who disappears, a new will that vanishes, a convenient death. Thorne didn't want you, Elara, Silas said, the truth dawning on him with sickening clarity. He wanted you gone, silent. He spread the rumors of you being a curse to discredit you so that if you ever spoke about that new will, no one would believe you. He was afraid of you. And when Silas had taken her, giving her a safe haven, Thorne had tolerated it. But when he saw that Silas was not just harboring her but believing in her, building a life with her, Thorne had panicked. He knew Silas would eventually hear the story of the will, so he had to silence Elara for good, using the very rumors he had created as his weapon. He's not just a liar, Silas growled, his hand gripping the bars. He's the murderer. The realization was a cold, hard certainty in his gut. But it was one thing to know it and another to prove it. He had a motive, but Thorne had the town, the preacher, and a vial of poison he'd conveniently found. That evening, as Silas sat alone in his bleak hotel room, a young boy knocked on his door. He was a scrawny kid, no more than 12, with wide, nervous eyes. It was Billy, the stable boy who cared for Silas's horse. "Mr. Blackwood, sir," the boy stammered, twisting a ragged cap in his hands. "What is it, son?" I heard them talking, in the saloon," Billy whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. "Mr. Thorne and some other men. They were laughing. Mr. Thorne was bragging. He said he had an insurance policy. Said, the lawyer, Elias Thorne, he's his cousin, and he paid him a lot of money to lose the case on purpose." The boy's words hit Silas like a physical blow. The lawyer. The one man he was counting on was a traitor. Thorne hadn't just rigged the jury, he'd bought the offense. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Silas. They were completely and utterly trapped. He had no evidence, no allies, and now no lawyer. He leaned against the wall, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had promised to save her, and he was leading her to the gallows. But then, he thought of Elara's face, her unwavering belief in him. He thought of her hands in the soil, her laughter as she chased the chickens, her kiss on the porch. He thought of the life they had started to build. He would not let that snake Thorne take it from them. If the law was a corrupt game, he would stop playing by its rules. He had one last desperate card to play. It was a long shot, a wild gamble that could get them both killed. But it was the only chance they had left. He had to find the lawyer, Abernathy. Silas's plan was born of pure desperation. He had to find Abernathy. He had to get a sworn statement about the new will, and he had to do it before the circuit judge. A man known for swift, harsh sentences arrived in Redemption Gulch. He had less than 3 days. He started at the telegraph office, asking the clerk where Mr. Abernathy had relocated. The clerk, a man whose loyalty was to coin, not to Marcus Thorne, was willing to check the old logs for a price. For a silver dollar, Silas got his answer. Stone Creek, a small mining town 2 days' ride north, deep in the mountains. It was a fool's errand. Even if he rode day and night, he would be cutting it impossibly close. But it was the only path he could see. He went to the jail for his morning visit with Elara. He didn't tell her about her lawyer's betrayal. He couldn't bear to extinguish the last flicker of hope in her eyes. Instead, he told her his plan to find Abernathy. "It's too dangerous, Silas," she pleaded, her fingers clutching the bars. 2 days' ride, alone? And what if he refuses to speak? "He's the only one who can prove you're telling the truth," Silas said, his voice firm. He reached through the bars, his hand covering hers. "I have to try. You have to be strong. Can you do that for me?" She looked into his determined, stormy eyes and saw the depth of his resolve. He was risking everything for her. She nodded, her own fear giving way to a fierce pride. "Be safe, Silas, please." He bought the fastest horse he could afford from the livery, leaving his own tired mount behind. He packed light, a canteen, a bag of jerky, and his old Colt revolver, which he checked and loaded with grim purpose. As he was about to ride out, Sheriff Tate stopped him. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Silas met his gaze. He had no reason to trust the man, but he was desperate for any ally. He made a snap decision. To find a man named Abernathy, the lawyer who drew up Samuel Miller's last will. Tate's eyes widened slightly in understanding. "Stone Creek. I remember now. He left in a hurry." The sheriff looked around, then lowered his voice. "Listen to me, Blackwood. I don't like what Thorne is doing. It smells wrong. But my hands are tied. If you find Abernathy, you get him to write it down, get it notarized. It's the only way the judge will even look at it." He paused, then added, "Watch your back. Thorne has long arms." It wasn't much, but it was a sliver of support. Silas nodded his thanks and spurred his new horse, galloping out of Redemption Gulch as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. The ride was brutal. He pushed the horse and himself to the limits of endurance. The trail into the mountains was steep and treacherous. He rode through the blistering heat of day and the biting cold of night, stopping only for brief moments to rest the horse and chew on a piece of tough jerky. The faces of the sneering townsfolk, the sound of the cell door clanging shut, the memory of Elara's face. It all fueled him, burning away his exhaustion. He arrived in Stone Creek late on the second day, covered in dust and half dead from fatigue. It was a grimy, hard-bitten town clinging to the side of a mountain. He found Abernathy's name on a shingle outside a small office tucked between a raucous saloon and a laundry. He pounded on the door. It was opened by a small balding man with a green eyeshade and spectacles perched on his nose. He looked like a frightened rabbit. "Mr. Abernathy?" Silas asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Yes," the man squeaked, intimidated by Silas's wild appearance. "My name is Silas Blackwood. I need to talk to you about Samuel Miller's will." Abernathy's face went pale. He tried to slam the door, but Silas was faster, his boot blocking the way. He pushed his way inside. "Please," Abernathy stammered, backing away. "I don't know anything. You know that Samuel Miller drew up a new will, leaving his store to his nephew. You know that will disappeared, and you know that his wife, Elara, is about to be tried for his murder because of it," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. Abernathy started to tremble. "Thorne, he threatened me. He said he'd ruin me, that he'd tell everyone I was a fraud. He said he'd see me dead if I ever spoke of it. I've a family, and an innocent woman is about to hang." Silas roared, his control snapping. He grabbed the front of Abernathy's shirt. "She has no one but me. You are going to write down everything you know, and you are going to sign it in front of a notary. Now!" Terror gave way to a dawning shame in the little lawyer's eyes. He looked at the desperate, exhausted man before him and saw the conviction of a righteous cause. He sagged in Silas's grip. "All right," he whispered. "All right." They found a notary public working late in the land grant office. Abernathy, his hand shaking, wrote out a detailed affidavit. He described the new will, Samuel's distrust of his brother and Marcus Thorne's threats after Sam. He signed it, and the notary stamped it with his official seal. Silas snatched the precious document, his heart pounding with a desperate triumph. He had it. He had the proof. He threw a few coins on Abernathy's desk. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He practically ran back to his horse. He had to ride all night to get back in time. As he mounted, a sixth sense, honed by years of solitude and survival, screamed at him. He ducked instinctively just as a gunshot cracked through the night air, splintering the wooden post where his head had been a second before. Two men stepped out of the dark alley across the street, guns drawn. They were hired thugs, their faces hard and merciless. Thorne's long arms, as the sheriff had warned. He had been followed. Silas spurred his horse, leaning low over its neck as another shot whizzed past his ear. He galloped out of town, the thugs mounting their own horses in pursuit. The chase was on. His desperate race against the clock had become a desperate race for his life. The mountain pass was a treacherous labyrinth of rock and shadow, and it became Silas's only ally. He urged his horse onward, the sound of hoofbeats behind him a relentless drumbeat of doom. They were gaining. He was exhausted and his horse was nearing its limit while his pursuers were fresh. He risked a glance back. 2 riders, dark silhouettes against the moonlit ridge, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He had to do something or they would run him down and put a bullet in his back before he ever saw the lights of Redemption Gulch again. Ahead, the trail narrowed, hugging a sheer cliff face. On his right, a steep, scree-covered slope fell away into a dark, wooded ravine. It was a gamble, but his only one. Daring sharply off the trail, Silas sent his horse sliding and scrambling down the loose rock of the slope. The animal fought for footing, its breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. The thugs, surprised by the maneuver, pulled up at the edge, firing wildly into the darkness below. Bullets pinged off the rocks around Silas as he reached the relative cover of the pine trees at the bottom of the ravine. He dismounted, grabbing his rifle from its scabbard and slapped his horse on the rump, sending it crashing deeper into the woods. He flattened himself behind a thick ponderosa pine, his heart hammering against his ribs, the precious affidavit a stiff weight inside his coat. He could hear the men dismounting above, their voices carrying in the still night air. "He's down there somewhere," one shouted. "Spread out, the boss wants that paper and he wants Blackwood dead." Silas calmed his breathing, the familiar weight of the Colt in his hand a cold comfort. This was no longer about the law, this was about survival. It was him against them, a primal contest in the heart of the wilderness. He waited, listening. He heard the crunch of a boot on dry pine needles to his left. He raised the revolver, peering around the edge of the tree. A hulking shape was moving stealthily from tree to tree, a pistol glinting in the moonlight. Silas didn't hesitate. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger, but he knew how to shoot. He aimed for the man's gun hand and fired. The shot echoed like a thunderclap in the ravine. The man cried out, dropping his pistol as he clutched a shattered wrist. The second man, alerted by the shot, opened fire in Silas's direction, bullets thudding into the tree that shielded him. Silas scrambled for new cover, moving deeper into the woods as splinters flew past his face. He was now in a deadly game of cat and mouse. He was one man, wounded in spirit but not in body, against a wounded man and a desperate one. He used his knowledge of the wild, moving silently, using the terrain to his advantage. He doubled back, circling around his pursuers. He found the second man kneeling over his injured partner. "He's just a rancher, nothing more," the man was grumbling. "We'll flush him out." "Not before I bleed to death," the first man groaned. From the shadows behind them, Silas's voice was a low, chilling growl. "Drop the gun, or your friend dies first." The second thug spun around, his eyes wide with shock. Silas stood 20 feet away, his Colt aimed squarely at the injured man's head. The thug's gaze flickered between Silas and his partner. He was a hired gun, not a martyr. With a curse, he let his pistol fall to the ground. "Now get on your horses and ride," Silas commanded. "Tell Thorne I'm coming for him." Mason punched Thorne. The men, one clutching his bloody wrist, scrambled back up the slope. Silas watched them go, listening until the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the night. He was alone again, the silence of the woods pressing in. He was alive and he had the affidavit, but he had lost precious hours. The sun was already beginning to tinge the eastern sky with gray. The trial was today. He found his horse, miraculously unharmed, and pushed it harder than ever before. He rode with a reckless abandon, fueled by adrenaline and the image of Elara's face. The hours blurred into a montage of dust, sweat, and burning muscles. He crested the final rise above Redemption Gulch as the sun was high in the sky. He could see the town below, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse, the saloon, hastily converted for the judge's arrival. He was running out of time. He urged his horse into a desperate final gallop, thundering down the main street. People scattered, shouting in alarm at the sight of the wild-eyed man on the lathered horse. He leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, staggering toward the courthouse doors. He burst inside, his chest heaving, his clothes torn and dirty. The room was packed. At the front, on a raised platform, sat the circuit judge, a formidable man with a face like a hanging verdict. In the witness box sat a smirking Marcus Thorne, spinning his web of lies, and at a small table next to a bored-looking, well-dressed lawyer sat Elara. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening first in shock, then in a flood of desperate hope. "Stop!" Silas croaked, his voice raw. He held up the affidavit. This trial is a sham. The man on that stand is the real murderer." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Judge Morrison, a man who did not suffer interruptions gladly, slammed his gavel down. The sound cracked like a whip. "Bailiff, remove this man," he boomed, his jowls quivering with outrage. Sheriff Tate moved to intercept Silas, but his steps were slow, hesitant. He had seen the state Silas was in, the desperate truth burning in his eyes. "Your Honor, please," Silas yelled, pushing past the sheriff. He threw the notarized affidavit onto the judge's bench. "This is a sworn statement from the lawyer Alistair Abernathy. It proves that Samuel Miller wrote a new will disinheriting his brother. It proves that Marcus Thorne had the motive for murder." Marcus Thorne leaped to his feet, his face a mask of purple fury. "Lies! This man is insane. He's been bewitched by that black-hearted woman." Elias Thorne, the Baden-paid for defense lawyer, also stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous disruption. This document is clearly a forgery." Judge Morrison, his curiosity piqued despite his anger, picked up the paper. He read the first few lines, his expression shifting from irritation to intense focus. The official notary seal from Stone Creek was unmistakable. "Silence!" the judge roared, and this time the room fell completely quiet. He continued to read, his brow furrowed. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Silas's gaze was locked on Elara. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and love. He had come for her. He had fought for her. Finally, the judge looked up, his cold eyes fixing on Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this affidavit alleges that you were to be cut out of your brother's will entirely. Is that true?" "No, of course not. It's a fabrication," Thorne blustered, sweat beading on his forehead. "My brother loved me." "Did he?" the judge continued, his voice like chipping ice. "It also alleges that you threatened Mr. Abernathy, forcing him to flee town and conceal the existence of this new will. Did you do that?" "This is slander. I am a respected member of this community." Silas saw his chance. "Then you won't mind telling the court where you were last night, Thorne?" he challenged, his voice ringing with conviction. Thorne's head snapped toward him. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Last night 2 men tried to kill me in the mountains outside Stone Creek," Silas announced to the stunned courtroom. "They said their boss wanted this affidavit and they wanted me dead. Now who else knew I was going to Stone Creek? Who else had a reason to stop me from bringing this back?" The crowd murmured, their gazes shifting from Silas to Thorne. The certainty of Elara's guilt was beginning to crumble, replaced by a thrilling, horrifying suspicion. Thorne began to panic. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "He's lying. I was here, in the saloon. Ask anyone." "I'll do better than that," Sheriff Tate said, stepping forward. He was no longer hesitant. He was a lawman who smelled a rat. "I'll ask the 2 men I just found riding into town on tired horses, one of them with a fresh bullet wound in his wrist." The color drained completely from Thorne's face. He looked from the sheriff's stony expression to the judge's damning one, to the faces of the townsfolk, which were now filled with accusation instead of adoration. He was trapped. With a wild cry of rage and fear, Thorne lunged, but not for the door. He lunged for Elara. He grabbed her, pulling her from her chair and holding a small Derringer pistol, which he'd had concealed in his coat, to her head. "Nobody move," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She's the one who ruined everything. The witch. I'll see her in hell." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted. Silas, however, was preternaturally calm. All the fatigue, all the pain fell away, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He had not come this far to lose her now. "Let her go, Thorne," Silas said, his voice low and steady, drawing the man's attention. "It's over. It's over when I say it's over," Thorne screamed, his eyes wild, his hand shaking. The gun pressed cruelly against Elara's temple. Elara, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, looked at Silas. She saw the love and terror in his eyes. She would not be his undoing. With a sudden, desperate strength, she stomped her heel down hard on Thorne's instep and drove her elbow back into his ribs. Thorne grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He launched himself forward, not at Thorne, but at the table beside him. He kicked it with all his might, sending it crashing into Thorne's legs. Thorne stumbled, his balance gone. The Derringer fired, the shot going wild, shattering a window pane. In that same instant, Silas was on him, his hands closing around Thorne's throat, wresting the gun away and throwing the man to the floor with a force that shook the boards. Sheriff Tate and 2 other men were there at once, hauling the sputtering, defeated Thorne to his feet. "Marcus Thorne," the sheriff said, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists, his voice full of grim satisfaction. "You're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Miller and for the attempted murder of Silas Blackwood." As they dragged Thorne away, whimpering and cursing, the courtroom was silent. Then someone started to clap. It was the blacksmith. Then the doctor joined in. Soon the entire room was filled with applause. It was a fickle, shallow penance for their earlier judgment, but it was a penance nonetheless. Silas ignored them all. He only had eyes for Elara. He rushed to her side, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Are you all right?" he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, unable to speak, and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. She clung to him, shaking as he held her tight, his own body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He was her shield, her champion, her rescuer. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his stern expression softened with something that looked almost like admiration. "Ms. Miller, or I suppose it is Miss Elara," he corrected himself. "You are free to go. All charges are dismissed. The court offers its sincerest apologies." Silas held Elara, shielding her from the prying eyes of the town. He had bought her at auction for $5, a woman branded a curse. And in the end, she hadn't been his miracle. They had been each other's. They left the courthouse and walked into the sunlight, a new world awaiting them. The people of Redemption Gulch parted for them, their faces a mixture of shame, awe, and curiosity. They were no longer Silas Blackwood the recluse and Elara the Black Widow. They were the heroes of a story that would be told and retold in the territory for years to come. Silas didn't acknowledge them. He led Elara to the wagon, helped her onto the seat with a gentleness that spoke volumes, and they began the journey home. They rode in a comfortable, profound silence, the landscape around them seeming brighter, the air cleaner. The ranch, when it came into view, was not the desolate, dying place Elara had first seen. It was a vibrant, thriving homestead. The corn stood tall in the fields, the garden was a riot of color, and the sound of running water from their ditch was the sweetest music in the world. When Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, he didn't get down right away. He turned to her, his stormy eyes soft. "The indenture contract?" he said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out the folded, worn paper that had bound her to him. "It's null and void, of course. You're a free woman, Elara. You can go anywhere you want. I can give you the money from the harvest, enough to get you started somewhere new." His words were a gift, the ultimate proof of his love for her. He was not her owner, he was her partner, and he was willing to let her go if that was what she truly wanted. Elara looked at him, at his strong, earnest face. She looked at the home they had built together with their own hands, their own sweat, their own hope. She looked at the land that had been resurrected just as they had been. "What if this is where I want to be?" she asked softly. "What if the only place I want to start a new life is right here, with you?" A slow, brilliant smile spread across Silas's face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "Are you sure? A broken-down rancher on the edge of nowhere?" "You're not broken anymore, Silas," she said, leaning into his touch. "And this isn't nowhere. This is home." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or grateful relief. It was a kiss of deep, abiding love, a kiss that promised a future. It was a kiss of beginnings. That evening, as the sun set, they sat on the porch. Silas had a small fire going in the yard, and he held the indenture contract in his hand. $5, he said, a note of wonder in his voice as he looked at the paper. "It was the last of my money. I spent everything I had on a miracle I didn't even know I needed." He then tossed the paper into the fire. They watched together as the flames curled around the edges, turning the words of bondage into black, floating ash that disappeared into the starry night sky. The past was gone, burned away. Only the future remained. Silas took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. They were scarred, calloused hands, both of them, the hands of survivors, the hands of builders. "I love you, Elara," he said, his voice quiet and sure in the twilight. "And I love you, Silas," she replied, her heart full to bursting. They sat there for a long time, watching the fire dance, their shoulders touching, the vast silent peace of the western sky enveloping them. He had bought a woman at auction, a supposed curse the world had thrown away. He had paid $5, and in return, she had given him back his life, his soul, and a love more precious than all the gold in the mountains. She was his miracle, and he, she knew with every fiber of her being, was hers.